When it comes to the philosophy of death, existentialist views on the cessation of life and the nature of the self dive into the very questions about the nature of human existence itself. And it examines how death influences our understanding, the understanding of who we are, how we live, and how we should confront what is seen as the inevitability of the end of one's life. And so when we think about metaphysical perspectives on death, the existentialist perspectives are as important as any of the perspectives we've so far explored when looking at the philosophy of mind. And so the result of that is that in this lesson, we're going to continue our metaphysical studies on the philosophy of death, and we're going to examine the existentialist perspectives themselves on the idea of death and the self. And we're going to begin with Martin Heidegger. Now, I should note that for those of you who want to dive into existentialism in more detail, I have a series that I did a couple of years ago on existentialism, a sort of introductory series examining some of the key thinkers and some of the key ideas of existentialist philosophy in a more general format. This video is going to be focusing specifically on existentialist perspectives on death. So, Martin Heidegger's philosophy of death is one of the most influential when we think about existentialist treatments of the subject. And for Heidegger, death is not just a biological event, but it could also be described as an existential condition. Death as an existential limit is the way in which we could describe it, because human beings are the only creatures who are aware of their own mortality. And this awareness of their own mortality shapes fundamentally how we live. Death represents the ultimate limitations on human existence, because it is the point where all possibilities and all future endeavors come to an end. So it is the end of being, the cessation of any potentiality to become or to do or to be anything further. And so within this line of thought, Heidegger argues that our awareness of death has the potential to bring about both authenticity and anxiety in the ways in which we live our lives. When we face our mortality directly, we are confronted with the fundamental uncertainty of life. The realization of death, the realization of mortality, induces a sense of angst, a deep existential anxiety that stems from our understanding that everything that we do is ultimately finite, that there is no ultimate meaning to be found beyond our own existence. And this, of course, is something that strikes to the very heart of basic existentialist philosophy, the study of and the search for a philosophy of meaning. This anxiety also opens the possibility for authentic living. So it's not just a sense of anxiety about death, but is also a sense of authenticity, because it allows us to choose to live in accordance with our true desires and values, rather than conforming to the roles and obligations imposed by others, knowing that, regardless of what the consequences are of failing to conform or refusing to conform, those consequences cannot follow us after our inevitable death. Heidegger refers to the social tendency to live inauthentically by conforming to the collective norms of society. He calls this das Man, the they, where most people live in a state of detraction, ignoring or avoiding the reality of their own death and the personal responsibility that comes as a result of knowing about and having an understanding of one's own mortality. The inauthentic existence at this point then is a way of escaping the anxiety of our own finite nature, of our own finite self. Only when we can come about confronting death directly can we live authentically, as I mentioned in the previous point. Acknowledging our own individuality and our own responsibility that we have for our own choices is an important part of this confrontation process. And so the concept of being toward death involves accepting the reality of our mortality and recognizing it as a motivator for genuine existence. And then finally, when thinking about the philosophy of Martin Heidegger as applied to the philosophy of death, Heidegger highlights the idea that death is the one experience that cannot be shared with others. It is the most wholly individual moment of every single person's life. No one else can die for us or live our life for us. And so it is in this sense that death is a deeply personal endeavor, and that our relationship to it is one of the most defining aspects of who we are as people. We must face our death alone, and this emphasizes the importance of making authentic choices about one's life. Additionally, existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre comes up with and defines death as a very important process within the definition of the self. So Jean-Paul Sartre places quite a significant emphasis on the idea of freedom and choice and personal responsibility. And according to this view, the self is not a fixed essence, but it is instead created through the decisions and the actions of an individual with their own personal responsibility. Death, as a result, plays a significant role in this philosophy, not necessarily as a final end, but really as an essential moment that shapes how we understand and how we come to define ourselves. And so we begin thinking about Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism with relation to death by thinking about the idea of existence preceding essence. Famously, this was what Sartre declared. And what he meant by this is that there are no predetermined purposes or natures that define who we are. We are free to choose our own path, and it is through these choices that we define ourself. And for Sartre, then, this idea of existence precedes the general meaning of ourselves, the general essence of our meaning. And so death, as a result, for Sartre, is a reminder of the ultimate freedom we have in life, the freedom to act, to create meaning, and to choose our own future. This freedom also comes with a certain degree of responsibility. And the awareness of death forces us to confront the weight of this responsibility, as we cannot undo the choices that are made. And once we have come to the point at which death is upon us, then this means that we have no ability to confront any of these choices at all. These are final choices at the point at which we die. And so you can understand Sartre's views about death as thinking of death as a boundary that defines human existence. Death is the final moment in which the self can no longer make choices. It can no longer have this idea of freedom and responsibility, this idea of existence preceding essence. It is the point at which the boundary line at which that jurisdiction ends fundamentally. And so, in this sense, death gives life a sense of urgency, but it also brings with it a sense of meaning. By recognizing that we are all going to be heading towards death, we are encouraged to live authentically, with authenticity, and make decisions that reflect our true desires and our true beliefs. In examining death, Sartre does not focus on death as a religious or a metaphysical phenomenon, but he instead views it as just an essential part of the human experience. It is the ultimate absurdity in Sartre's worldview, especially when considered in the light of the apparent meaninglessness of the universe. There is no inherent meaning to life. There is no meaning in reality, in the universe. There is no meaning associated there. And death is something that underscores this fact. However, Sartre advocates for embracing this absurdity, finding meaning through our own choices and actions rather than trying to confide in the absurdity of the religious or the metaphysical or the spiritual in trying to find some kind of transcendental justification for your own life, instead thinking of your own choices and actions as the fundamental meaning of the universe. Finally then, Sartre's concept of bad faith refers to the idea of the self-deception people engage in when they avoid acknowledging the full extent of one's freedom and one's responsibility. So a lot of these ideas about death and existentialism and meaning, and according to Jean-Paul Sartre, are all baked into and are all essentially leading back to this fundamentally important concept, the concept of existence preceding essence, the concept of freedom and responsibility. Rather than confronting the reality of death and the choices that come with it, individuals live in bad faith, and they do so by adhering to societal roles and external expectations, and this denies them their freedom. It denies them the responsibility that comes with their freedom. And so, the awareness of death can help individuals to avoid this bad faith by forcing them to confront their own mortality. We will think about Albert Camus in more detail later on, and we will talk about the absurdity of death in and of itself as a sort of an important point about the nature of personhood. But Camus is perhaps known for his exploration of the absurd in a general setting, and the tension that exists between humans' search for meaning and the indifference that the universe essentially responds to with. There is a certain absurdity, according to Albert Camus, in relation to this particular situation. Humans are searching for meaning, and there is a certain response from the universe, a response of indifference. In his very famous essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus explores the philosophy of death through the lens of the absurd. And so, for Camus, the absurd arises from the realization that life does not offer inherent meaning. Humans crave purpose, but the universe is indifferent to this desire. The universe doesn't respond to this craving with any kind of remedy. Death, then, as the ultimate end, underscores the absurdity of this existence. It is a constant reminder that no matter what we do, we are all doomed to die, and so nothing we accomplish can ultimately escape this fate. Now, these are, I think people sometimes get existentialism the wrong way. Some of these ideas are sort of seen as and viewed as particularly negative or particularly doomerist, if you will, or nihilistic. But fundamentally, existentialism is seen as, for a lot of people, a emancipatory philosophy, in the sense that by fundamentally unveiling the idea that the universe does not have meaning and that humans craving for meaning is met with indifference on the part of the universe, opens the door to you living an authentic life, or to living a life that does have meaning and finding meaning in life itself. That's the purpose of existentialism, at least in my opinion. The way I view and read existentialism is not in a pejorative sense, but in a more positivistic kind of sense. And so ultimately, when we read the Myth of Sisyphus, and when we read Albert Camus, and we talk about the fact that death is the ultimate end, and it underscores the absurdity of existence, and it is the constant reminder that no matter what we do, we are all doomed to die, this is part of an emancipatory philosophy, an emancipatory idea. The idea that living life with meaning and finding meaning in oneself is a far better mode of existence than that of constantly craving some kind of fundamental purpose and meaning within the universe that the universe is indifferent in response. So, despite the apparent meaninglessness of existence, Camus argues that we must not fall into despair. This is a point that I've just made in relation to existentialism more generally. We should instead revolt against the absurdity of life by embracing it fully. This would involve accepting death as an inevitable part of life and choosing to live life authentically, finding meaning in one's experiences, relationships, and actions rather than on external sources of meaning. And famously, in The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus uses the example of Sisyphus, the mythological figure who was confined and condemned to endlessly roll up a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down at the end of the day. For Camus, Sisyphus represents the human condition because it represents the endless struggle in a world that is meaningless, and yet they find purpose in that struggle themselves. So, specifically in the myth of Sisyphus, Camus argues that death is the ultimate limit to one's life, but that it should not create a sense of depression or despair in one's general psyche. Instead, we must accept life as finite, and that death gives life its sense of urgency. By embracing the absurdity of death, we are free to create our own meaning and to live fully in the face of a universe that, when asked about meaning, responded with indifference. So the absurd hero, in regard to this, is the key figure in Camus' philosophy, someone who acknowledges the absurdity of life and death, but chooses to live with dignity and rebellion against the meaninglessness of existence. This hero does not seek refuge in illusions or spirituality or false hopes, but instead accepts death as a reality and creates meaning regardless, and creates meaning in the face of it. This sort of presents the absurd hero as a rebellious and a revolutionary figure, somebody who stands up in the face of meaninglessness and through a sense of bravery is able to find meaning in one's own existence and to find dignity in one's own life, despite the fact that they are looking in the face of absurdity. Finally then, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time thinking about the idea of freedom and the self and the concept of death in existentialism. Because in existentialism, death is seen not as a final end, but is instead viewed as a pivotal aspect of the human condition, because it shapes the way we define ourselves. By confronting our own mortality, we are confronted with the reality that we are free to choose how we should live. And those choices are what makes us who we are. Existentialist philosophers emphasize that we do not have any kind of preordained essence. By contrast, we create our essence through our own actions and our own decisions. Death provides the ultimate boundary to our existence, because it reminds us that we must choose to live authentically and meaningfully within the constraints of a finite life. The awareness of death, the understanding that death comes for us all, and that it is a fundamentally individualistic process that everybody has to endure, can be a powerful motivator to live a life of authenticity, to make choices that reflect who we truly are, rather than living in a passive or in a way that is according to the expectations of others. And so, in the confrontation of death, we are called to take responsibility for our own lives through our own choices. And this is really why some people view existentialism as really shaking the shackles away and being emancipatory in nature. It provides us with a sense of freedom for the living of a life that is authentic, because we are no longer chained to the idea of meaning in the universe, and death is the strongest representation of that particular fact.